The hall at Ashmore Park was a long room, and that autumn morning it was full of Cecily's things. Her writing case sat propped against the oak wainscoting, its brass fittings dulled from 3 years of use. Beside it, a trunk containing her winter gowns, a hat box wrapped in brown paper, the small rosewood looking-glass that had been a wedding gift from her mother. 2 footmen stood at a careful distance from the pile, their faces arranged in the particular blankness that servants learn when they have been asked to do something they know to be wrong. The front door was open to the October wind, and dead leaves had already skipped across the threshold and come to rest against the nearest trunk. Cecily stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at it all. She was 24 years old, 3 weeks a widow, and she had lived in this house since she was 21. She did not cry. She had spent most of the 3 weeks since Robert died doing whatever crying she was going to do, and what remained now was a steadier, colder thing. Less like grief, and more like the knowledge of what she was. She was the late Earl's wife, and the new Earl had thrown her belongings into the hall. She had not yet seen the new Earl's face. She went down the stairs, and her heel caught on the 4th step where the carpet had been loose since last winter. And she steadied herself on the banister, and she arrived at the bottom with her chin level and her hands composed at her sides. She looked at her writing case, and at the hat box, and at the open door with the leaves coming through it, and she turned and walked back in the direction from which she had come. She was not leaving yet. Nan was still in the kitchen. To understand why Cecily Vane would not walk out of a house whose master had made his wishes plain, you needed to understand what Ashmore Park had been before the inheritance changed it. Robert, the 3rd Earl of Ashmore, had been a man of genuine kindness and indifferent health, and he had known from the early years of their marriage that he was unlikely to outlive the entail. He had told Cecily this plainly, in the way he told her most things, sitting across from her at the small table in the morning room where the sun came in best. He had also told her, with equal plainness, that their 3 years together had been the best years he could account for, and that he intended to arrange things so that she would be comfortable. He had arranged the dower provision, £120 per year, through Mr. Holt, the family solicitor, and he had done it in writing, and with a proper seal. And Cecily trusted this. What he had not been able to arrange was the matter of the Earl's succession, because the earldom in Ashmore Park itself passed by strict entail to his younger brother, Edmund, and there was nothing Robert's goodwill or his settlements could do about that. Edmund. She had heard his name a great deal in 3 years, and met him precisely twice. He had not come for the wedding. He had sent a brief letter, correct in every formality and empty of everything else, and Robert had read it aloud at breakfast and set it aside without comment. And Cecily had understood from that silence that there was a distance between the brothers that had nothing to do with Miles. Edmund had come once, in the 2nd year, for a fortnight at Christmas, and Cecily remembered a man who sat at the far end of every dinner table and looked at nothing in particular, whose jaw was the kind that seemed carved rather than grown, and who had departed on the 28th of December with a handshake for his brother and a correct bow for Cecily, and no explanation for either. Robert had died on the 2nd of October. Edmund had inherited on the same day. Within a fortnight he had arrived at Ashmore Park. The footman had moved her things the morning of his 2nd day. The morning room was empty when Cecily reached it, which meant that Mrs. Aldous, the housekeeper, had already smoothed herself away from the situation as smoothly as she did most difficult things. Cecily stood at the window that looked south across the lawn toward the Dower cottage, a 1/4 of a mile away across the autumn grass, its chimney cold. She was thinking about Nan. Nan was 14 years old, and she was an orphan. And she had been taken into the household by Robert 2 years prior, with an informality that was entirely characteristic of him. Her parents had been a farm family on the eastern edge of the Ashmore estate, and they had died in the same fever that had swept through the cottages the previous winter, and Robert had brought her in and given her a position as Cecily's maid and announced her his ward. And that had been the whole of the formal arrangement. There was nothing in writing. There was only Robert's word, and Robert was 3 weeks dead. If Cecily left Ashmore Park without securing Nan's position, the girl would be dismissed without wages, because the new Earl did not know she existed and had no reason to protect her. This was the only thought in Cecily's mind as she turned away from the window and walked back through the passage toward the kitchen stairs. Whatever the new Earl had decided about her belongings, she was not going through that front door until she had spoken to someone about Nan. She found the kitchen in a state of restrained anxiety. Cook was kneading bread with a force that suggested she had opinions she was not voicing, and the scullery maid had retreated to the far end of the room. Nan herself was at the long table, polishing silver with a concentration that meant she had heard everything and was pretending she had not. She was a slight girl, dark-haired, with the particular steadiness of children who have learned that composure is their best defense. She looked up when Cecily came in, and the steadiness held, and Cecily felt the familiar tightening in her throat that Nan's composure always produced. "I need you to stay here for a little while longer," Cecily said. "Will you do that?" Nan said yes, and asked no questions, because she never did. Cecily went back upstairs to find the new Earl. She found him in the study. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, and he had not heard her come in, or had heard her and decided not to acknowledge it. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the set of his shoulders. He was taller than she remembered, and the month since Christmas had put something harder in his frame, the kind of hardness that comes from sustained effort rather than idleness. He had Robert's dark hair, but where Robert's face had always carried a readiness toward expression, Edmund's was still. She had known that from before. She had not remembered quite how still. "I would like to speak with you," she said. He turned. His eyes were gray, the color of smoke over water, and they settled on her with an attention that was neither warm nor unkind, only extremely precise. There was a miniature on the desk beside him, small and oval in a gilt frame, and she could see at a glance that it was a portrait of Robert. She did not look at it for long. "Lady Ashmore," he said. The title was wrong. She was no longer Lady Ashmore. She was the Dowager Countess at best, and more practically speaking, she was simply Mrs. Vane, or perhaps Mrs. Robert Vane, if one wished to distinguish. The correction hovered in her mouth, and she let it stay there. "I want to ask you about my maid," she said. "She is 14 years old. Her name is Nan. Your brother took her in when her parents died and called her his ward, and there is no formal document. And I need to know whether she has a position here before I go anywhere." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Her wages will be continued," he said. "And her position? She is not a trained housemaid. She is my maid specifically. If I am to remove to the Dower cottage, I would ask that she be permitted to come with me. The cottage will need to be prepared. You will have it by the end of the week. I am asking about Nan, not about the cottage." The gray eyes sharpened slightly, a barely visible adjustment, the kind of focus that precedes a question or a calculation. "She may go with you," he said, "when the cottage is ready." Cecily nodded. She turned to go. She was nearly at the passage when he spoke again. "You have not asked about the Dower income." She stopped. She did not turn. "Mr. Holt has been my husband's solicitor for 15 years, and he drew up the settlement himself. I trust the settlement." She heard him say nothing. She went back down the stairs. She did not, in that moment, understand what the quality of his attention had been. She had read it as coldness, as the efficient assessment of a man who needed to dispose of a complication, and that was the shape her wound had already made for it, the groove of a woman who had been told by 3 years of London seasons before her marriage that she was pleasant and unremarkable and unlikely to be anyone's first choice. Robert had been her first choice, and she his, and she had been lucky. She had understood the luck clearly enough not to expect it twice. She was wrong about Edmund's attention, but she would not know that for some weeks. If you are already finding yourself wanting to know what was in Robert's letter, you are in exactly the right place. Stay with this story, because the letter matters more than either of them knew. The Dower cottage was ready in 4 days, and Cecily moved into it on a Thursday morning in late October, with Nan and a cartload of her own belongings, and the rosewood looking-glass that she placed on the small table by the east window. The cottage had 2 good rooms, and a kitchen, and a sleeping loft for Nan, and a hearth that drew well, and a garden that had been abandoned since the previous spring. And from the front window you could see the south lawn of Ashmore Park 300 yards distant. And sometimes, on still mornings, you could see a figure crossing it. She told herself she did not watch the figure. She was not always honest with herself about this. Edmund, in those first weeks, crossed the south lawn on his way to the eastern fields, more mornings than could be explained by the most direct route. He stopped once at the gate to the cottage garden, where Cecily was pulling dead vegetation from the beds with more vigor than skill, and asked her whether she needed anything. She told him the pump handle was stiff. He sent a man to fix it the next morning. He stopped again, 4 days later, to tell her that Mr. Holt would be at the park the following Tuesday to confirm the settlement figures, and to ask whether she preferred to come to the house or whether she would rather meet with Holt in the cottage. She said the cottage would suit her. He said he would send word. These were not the conversations of a man who found her inconvenient. They were, she told herself, simply the conversations of a man managing an estate and its associated obligations, and she was an obligation, and that was all. She was wrong again. The incident with the coal happened the 2nd week of November. The estate delivery had come short. 3 scuttles instead of the 4 she had been allocated, and Cecily had said nothing about it, being constitutionally unwilling to bring complaints to a house that had already demonstrated its readiness to deposit her belongings on the floor. She had made the coal stretch, as she had made other things stretch over the years of managing a house on a gentleman's income, and she was perfectly warm enough. Only she had allowed the fire to go lower than usual one afternoon when she was doing the mending, and Edmund had come to the door on his way back from the fields, and she had answered it herself because Nan was at the market in the village, and he had stepped into the sitting room and seen the low fire and the mending and the coal scuttle that was very nearly empty. He had said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." She had blinked. "I am inside." "The park. Come inside and take your supper there tonight. I'll have the coal corrected in the morning." "There is no need to make it an event, Your Grace. I am perfectly comfortable." "You are doing your mending in a cold room," he said. "Come inside." She went. She was surprised to find, on reflection, that she had wanted to. Supper at the park that night was quiet, the 2 of them at the far end of the long table with candles between them, and Edmund had asked her how long she had known Robert before their engagement, and she had said 6 weeks, and he had made a sound that was not quite a response, and she had asked him what he meant by it, and he had said, Robert was always quick. There had been something in his voice when he said it, not grief exactly, more the particular restraint of a man who has decided that grief belongs to a private room and not to a dinner table, and Cecily had recognized it because she had been practicing the same restraint herself for a month. She said, "He was kind first. That was what I noticed. Not quick." Edmund had looked at her across the candles, And whatever the quality of that look was, she could not name it, and she set down her fork and changed the subject. And by the time she walked back across the south lawn in the dark with her shawl pulled close, she had convinced herself she had imagined it. It was 2 weeks after that supper that Lady Dorothea arrived. Edmund's mother came in a carriage that bore the Ashmore crest, accompanied by her companion, her luggage, and Miss Portia Lacey, who was the daughter of a Derbyshire baronet, and who had known Edmund. Lady Dorothea was careful to mention within Cecily's hearing on the very first evening, since they were both in leading strings. Miss Lacey was 20 years old and very composed, and wore a gown the color of jonquil that turned the candlelight to gold, and she had the smooth, calibrated certainty of a young woman who has been told since childhood that she is the correct answer to any question. Lady Dorothea was a woman of 61 who had been a beauty at 20 and had converted that beauty, over 40 years, into authority. She wore her white hair dressed high, and her rings in perfect order, and her opinions like armor. She found Cecily in the drawing-room on her first evening, and looked at her for a long, weighing moment, and then said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as the next chair, "My dear, Robert's little widow, how you must miss the position." Cecily said, "Good evening, Lady Dorothea," and smiled, and went to ask Mrs. Aldous about the arrangements for tea. Over the following week, she learned the pattern of it. Lady Dorothea would find occasions to mention, in her careful, technically polite way, that the Dower cottage was comfortable enough for a woman of moderate claims, that Cecily had always seemed sensible enough to understand her own situation, that of course Robert's marriage had been a surprise, but one could hardly say it had been a lasting arrangement, and that Edmund would naturally be thinking about the earldom's future. Miss Lacey moved through these performances with an elegant patience, present at Lady Dorothea's shoulder, with the pleasant expression of someone who has been assured the part is hers, and needs only to wait for the stage to clear. Edmund said nothing. He was courteous to Miss Lacey at dinner, and attentive to his mother's conversation, and present at no private moments that Cecily could see. And Cecily read his silence as the silence of a man who had not yet made up his mind and was allowing the arrangement to progress on its own weight. She went back to crossing the south lawn alone. The evening she overheard the letter was the 3rd week of November, and it was not an evening she had intended to be in the study passage at all. She had come to the park to return a book she had borrowed from the library, and Mrs. Aldous was busy with the linen inventory, and Cecily had gone to leave the book on the library table herself, and the study door was ajar, and Edmund's voice came through the gap, low and flat and alone, which meant he was reading aloud to himself, in the habit she had noticed before. She had moved to pass by when she heard Robert's name. She stopped. She should not have stayed. She knew that, even then. She stayed. He was reading from a letter, and the voice with which he read it was different from any voice she had heard him use at a table or in a passage or across a south lawn, stripped of the level authority and carrying something underneath that she recognized after a moment as pain. She did not hear the whole of it. She heard Robert's handwriting in Edmund's voice saying that he had not much time, that he needed Edmund to come if he could come quickly, and then a passage about the estate that she did not follow, and then the words that she stood in the passage and held, "Look after her, Edmund. She is better than she knows, and she has had less of the world's recognition than she deserves. Look after her, and look after the child." A silence. The sound of a page being set down. Then Edmund said, to no one but himself, "I should have come." Cecily pressed her back against the passage wall and held very still. The rosewood looking-glass in the cottage. Nan asleep in the loft. £120 per year. These were the solid things, and she pressed herself against them. She heard the chair scrape back, and she walked quickly to the library, set the book on the table with fingers that were not entirely steady. and let herself out through the garden door. He had not come in time. Robert had written and asked him to come, and Edmund had not arrived before Robert died, and he had known for 6 weeks what the letter said, and had been carrying it alone. And every cold, correct exchange in that hall, and that study, and across that supper table had been a man doing penance in the only language he had. She stood in the garden in the cold air, and thought about that for a long time. She did not, after that evening, find his silence as easy to read as she had before. The days that followed were quieter in tone and more charged in their particulars. Edmund came to the cottage gate again on the Friday, this time with a question about the window latch that she suspected he had asked himself rather than a carpenter, because he wanted to see the latch for himself. And he examined it with a thoroughness that was not required, and said he would send Wilson, the estate carpenter, in the morning. She said thank you. He did not go immediately. He stood with his hand on the gate and looked out at the garden and said, Robert planted these beds himself. He was not a natural gardener. He was an enthusiastic one, she said. He put the lavender in entirely the wrong direction, and it never forgave him. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile exactly, but it was the nearest she had seen, and it was so small and so swift that she might have doubted it, except that it stayed with her all afternoon. Lady Dorothea found her the next morning at the cottage door, alone and without Miss Lacy, for the first time, and looked at her with an expression that was something between appraisal and satisfaction, and said, I have had a letter from my cousin at Harrogate, who mentions a companion's position that might suit a woman of your years and your particular situation. I thought it only charitable to mention it. Cecily looked at her steadily. That is very kind. I have a position, Lady Dorothea. A dower income, Lady Dorothea said, is not a position. It is a courtesy. It is a legal settlement, Cecily said, made in writing under seal by the previous Earl and confirmed by Mr. Holt. But I thank you for the thought. Lady Dorothea's expression did not waver. The confidence of it was complete, and Cecily recognized its quality. This was a woman who had been right about these things before, many times, and expected to be right again. The Ashmore Winter Assembly was held at the market town of Whitfield, 4 miles from the park, on the 3rd Friday of December, and it was the first of the winter gatherings, and consequently well attended by everyone who could manage the roads. Edmund was obliged to attend as the earldom's representative. Lady Dorothea attended because she attended everything. Miss Lacy came in a gown of pale silk with pearls at her throat and positioned herself with a sureness that suggested the evening had a shape she already knew. Cecily came because Mr. Holt had confirmed that morning that he would be at the assembly, and she had a petition with her that she intended to place in his hands. She had spent 4 days writing it. The petition requested formal written guardianship of Nan, now that the late Earl could no longer act as the girl's protector, and it laid out with some precision the grounds for the request. Nan's age, her position in Cecily's household, the late Earl's verbal designation, and the argument that a 14-year-old girl without family or formal guardian had a specific claim on the Court of Chancery that Cecily, as the adult woman responsible for her daily care, was best placed to make. Mr. Holt had not yet seen it. Cecily had not told Edmund about it. She had told Nan, who had sat very still at the kitchen table, and then said, in a voice she was carefully keeping level, that she thought Mrs. Vane was very good. The assembly room at Whitfield was lit with 2 rows of chandeliers and furnished with the year's best society, which in this part of Derbyshire meant perhaps 80 people, several of them genuinely fashionable, and the rest aspiring to it. Cecily arrived in her gray silk, which was her best gown and had been turned twice already, and she was aware in the usual way of how it read against the room's heavier colors. She found Mr. Holt near the far door, a compact man of 53, with a briefcase he never surrendered even at social events. And she was 3 steps from him when Lady Dorothea spoke from the center of the room. The voice was pitched to Carrie. Lady Dorothea had been pitching her voice to Carrie for 30 years, and she was extremely accomplished at it. "I do think it remarkable," she said, addressing Miss Lacey, but meant for everyone near enough to hear. "How some women cling to a house even after every obligation of delicacy requires them to remove. One might almost call it fortune-seeking, if one were unkind. Fortunately, we are not unkind. Are we, Portia?" The room went quiet, in the particular way that assembly rooms go quiet. Not entirely, and not honestly, but with a quality of held attention that meant everyone had heard and everyone was choosing whether to look. Cecily felt the heat rise in her face. She did not let it reach her expression. She had 20 feet between herself and Mr. Holt, and she crossed them. She was aware, from the edge of her vision, of Edmund standing near the door to the supper room. She did not look at him. She had made herself a rule about looking at him in rooms full of people, because looking at him in rooms full of people produced an awareness that was not useful and that she could not afford. She placed the petition in Mr. Holt's hands. "I would like to discuss Nan's formal guardianship," she said, keeping her voice steady, keeping it low, keeping it free of the tremor that the last 2 minutes had put into her chest. "I have written out the grounds. Will you read it now, or at your office on Monday?" Mr. Holt looked at her over his spectacles. He looked at the petition. He unfolded it and read the first page with the concentrated speed of a man who has read a great many documents in 53 years, and then he said, "The grounds are well stated, Mrs. Vane. I see no difficulty with the application." "Thank you," she said. "There is also," he said, "the matter of the dower rights, which I have been meaning to clarify with His Grace." The late Earl's settlement was specific. £120 per annum, the dower cottage in perpetuity, and the late Earl's personal effects to his widow's sole discretion. "I have been carrying the documentation for a fortnight." "Yes," she said, and found that she could not quite say more than that. Behind her, she heard Lady Dorothea's voice again, aimed now at a different section of the room, at Mrs. Whitmore, the magistrate's wife, who was the Assembly's most reliable conduit of information. "One understands the woman's difficulty. Naturally. Poor Robert was always susceptible to a pretty face and a Provence accent, and now the Earl must manage the consequence." She was still looking at Mr. Holt when she heard the room change. It did not change loudly. It changed in the way rooms change when someone moves through them with authority and intention. Conversations pausing, and then resuming, and then pausing again in a wave from one end to the other. And she turned, because she could not help turning. And she saw Edmund crossing the floor. He was crossing it toward her. He walked with the particular directness of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in the obstacles between himself and its execution, and the crowd moved for him the way crowds move for earls, and he stopped 2 feet from her, and he looked at her face for a moment with those gray eyes, and then he turned to face the room. The room was watching. All of it. Edmund said, in a voice that was level and not raised, and heard by every person in that assembly room, "This is Cecily Vane, the Countess of Ashmore. She is my wife, if she will have me, and she will remain so for as long as she chooses to tolerate my company. I should be grateful if that were understood." He turned back to her. He was still. He was always still. But this stillness was different. The stillness of a man standing in front of something he had decided to commit to entirely, and she could see in the line of his jaw the cost of saying it here, in this room, with all these witnesses. And she understood that he had chosen the room deliberately, because this was where the accusation had been made, and he had not seen another way to correct it that was sufficient to the occasion. She looked at him for a long moment. "You might have asked me first," she said very quietly, so that only he could hear. "I should have," he said. "I'm asking now." She heard Mr. Holt behind her, clearing his throat in the manner of a solicitor who is about to be professionally useful. "If I may, Your Grace, I have the settlement documentation, which confirms Lady Ashmore's legal standing under the late Earl's provision. The dower rights are not in question, and the cottage and the income are hers in perpetuity regardless. This is a formality, but a confirmed one." Edmund did not take his eyes from Cecily. "Will you?" he said. From the far end of the room she was aware of Lady Dorothea making no sound at all, which was itself a kind of sound, and Miss Lacy standing very still with an expression that she was working to keep pleasant, and that was costing her something, which Cecily did not gloat about, only registered. The room waited. Cecily thought about the letter in the study, and the voice in which Edmund had read it, and the man who had stood at a gate and said that Robert was always quick, and the low fire he had crossed a south lawn to correct. She thought about Nan at the kitchen table, keeping her voice level. She thought about what it was to have made up your mind in a cold, clear way about what you were owed, and to have been wrong. "Yes," she said. The word was small, and the room was large, and it carried to every corner of it. Mr. Holt said briskly, "Very good," in the tone of a man who has just confirmed the most important document of his professional season, and is pleased to have been present for it. Lady Dorothea, after a moment, inclined her head in the slight, formal way of a woman who has recognized that the ground has shifted and is choosing dignity over argument. It was the wisest choice available to her, and some part of Cecily was glad she had made it, because she had never wished the woman ill, only wished her less certain. Miss Lacy, to her credit, found Mrs. Whitmore and began a conversation about the musicians, which was the most graceful exit available, and she took it without hesitation. Edmund offered Cecily his arm. She took it and felt the warmth of his sleeve through her glove, and they crossed the assembly room together toward the supper room, and the room's attention gradually returned to itself, and the music started up again, and the evening continued as evening will. The following weeks passed, and the banns were read at the parish church at Whitfield on 3 consecutive Sundays, and the license came from London, and Mr. Holt confirmed the combined settlements in a document so thorough it occupied 11 pages, and the wedding was performed in the 2nd week of January before the vicar and Mrs. Aldous and Nan and 4 others, and it was brief and plain and completely what Cecily had wanted, which was a thing done properly in a small room without an audience. On the morning of the day, it snowed. It had been threatening snow for a week, the sky lowering and close, and it came that morning in the soft, determined way of early winter snow that intends to stay. And Cecily stood at the window of the dower cottage at first light, and watched it cover the south lawn in an even white that made everything very quiet. She was not, after the wedding night, in the dower cottage anymore, but she had come back for Nan, who was asleep in the loft and did not know yet what the morning held, and while she waited for the girl to wake, she built up the fire with the coal that was now always in full supply, and sat in the chair by the hearth with a shawl over her knees. On the mantelpiece was the small oval miniature she had brought from the study. Edmund had placed it there himself 3 days earlier, carrying it across the south lawn with both hands as if it were fragile, which it was not, as it was painted on ivory and set in gilt and quite sturdy. He had set it on the mantelpiece and looked at it for a moment, and said, "He asked me to look after you." Cecily had said, "I know." A silence. Then Edmund had said, "I was 6 hours too late." And she had put her hand over his hand, where it rested on the mantelpiece, and they had stood there for a while without speaking. The miniature showed Robert at 25, before the years of indifferent health had touched him, with his dark hair and his expression of readiness toward expression, and Cecily could look at it now with the full, complicated weight of love and loss that it deserved, without the flinching quality that had been there when grief was still raw. She was looking at it when she heard Nan come down the ladder from the loft, careful and quiet, not wanting to disturb. "Come and sit," Cecily said. "There is no hurry." Nan came and sat in the other chair, tucking her feet up under her in the way she had when she was not trying to be proper, and looked at the fire, and then looked at Cecily. "Mr. Holt sent the paper," Nan said. "The guardianship order, yes. It arrived yesterday." Nan looked at the fire again. Outside the window, the snow came down without haste, covering the garden, covering the lawn, covering the lane that led to Ashmore Park. "Mrs. Vane," Nan said, and then stopped. "It will be Lady Ashmore now," Cecily said. "You may take your time getting used to it. I'm still doing so myself." Nan smiled. It was a small, real smile, the kind that came from somewhere she did not usually let other people see. The fire crackled in the grate. The miniature sat on the mantelpiece in the particular quality of silence that follows a great deal of difficulty, the silence that is not emptiness, but rest. Cecily turned Robert's portrait so that it caught the firelight at the angle she preferred, the one that showed the curve of his mouth at its most characteristic, and she let her hand rest in her lap with the quiet weight of a woman who had been looked at, and seen, and chosen. The snow kept falling. Nan fell asleep again in the warmth, her head tilted against the chair's wing, her breathing slow and even. Somewhere across the south lawn, the great house held its own morning quiet, and presently there would be footsteps on the path, because Edmund had said he would come as soon as the horses were seen to, and she knew by now that when he said he would come, he came. She sat and watched the snow and waited for him, and the fire gave out its steady warmth. And it was enough. It was, at last, exactly enough. If Cecily's patience moved you, or Edmund's long walk across that assembly floor stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Every response is read, and your company on these stories is genuinely valued.